So welcome everyone to TAM Lab number 25. Today, Aaron Ramirez and myself will be going through a NSX-T install in my nested lab environment. So this should be pretty interesting. We did do this a couple weeks ago and just as a dry run, and I learned a lot. Aaron's definitely the expert compared to myself here, so I can recreate it, but I think I'll definitely need to lean on Aaron a bit for any technical questions that come up. So let's see. All right, so before I start, let me just give you a bit of background about what my lab environment looks like and why it's set up the way it is. So this vCenter you're looking at here is essentially my physical vCenter, physical lab environment. These two hosts are physical. These two hosts are physical. And within this cluster here, I've got 4 nested ESXi hosts and another vCenter. So if we log into this vCenter, you'll see 4 hosts that we've got here, right? So these 3 hosts are in a compute cluster with vSAN, and then the other one is a single management cluster. So the why it's set up this way is there is a blog that Keith Lee put out all around installing PKS in a lab environment. So that's ultimately what I want to do is get to PKS, but NSX-T is a prerequisite for that, right? So he did a great blog series here, 12-part blog series, and it walks you through every step. So that's essentially what I did to get to step 7 and 8, which we'll be doing here today, installing and configuring NSX-T. If we look at these hosts from a physical NIC perspective, I've got 4 physical NICs. The first 2 are used for the VDS. The other 2, which are unclaimed at this point, will be used for the NVDS, which you'll get to see. And then I've got a bunch of port groups hanging off that VDS with different VLANs, of course. So we've got a management one, vMotion, storage for the vSAN, and then we've got just a regular VM network, and then we have the overlay, and then 2 uplinks, which we'll get to see those get used here. So, Aaron, anything I forgot to mention or would be good from a background perspective before we get started?
Not that I can think of. Everything looks good.
Okay, so
ready to go.
What I did do is I deployed the NSX Manager ahead of time because it does take a long time, but I'm going to show you what that process is. So the very first step you're going to do is deploy your NSX Manager, right? So we're going to do deploy OVF template. We're going to browse to it. I'm not actually going to do it. I'll just go through the steps and then I'll cancel. We are doing NSX 2.4.1, which is the latest version. It's a pretty big OVF because it has all of the components within it. So we'll call this lab NSX 2, and you put it in a folder. We're going to put it on that management host. For the lab environment here, I'm going to do a small, which I think you have to do if you want to run the controller embedded. Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but
yes.
Yeah, so if you do extra small, it's only going to do the manager service. It won't do the controllers as well, which is great with NSX-T. You don't have to have a separate set of controller VMs.
Yeah, the extra small is actually meant more for the NSX Cloud Manager that you would put inside of like Azure AWS.
Got it. Okay. So we're going to choose our data store. I'll do thin provision. Choose your network. I'm going to do the management network here. And then we're going to fill out, all the other things here. So we're going to give it a password. And then an admin user password and an audit user password. And then what do we want for the usernames here? I'm going to do the default, so admin, audit, we'll skip this part. Host name, we will do lab NSX MGR2. We're going to choose the manager and the controller, not the cloud service manager. Our default gateway, and then our IP, netmask, and then of course our DNS servers, domain search list, NTP. I typically don't enable SSH. You can enable it after the fact through a couple steps, but best practice is not to enable that. And then this whole bottom section, you just leave it blank, right? It even says don't play with these. We would click next, and then we would click finish. It took like a half hour to deploy this in my lab because it's pretty large, and I think it's because it's in a nested environment. So I'm going to cancel here, but at this point, just imagine it deploying, waiting a half hour, and now we've got this Lab NSX Manager here. I booted it up, gave it some time, and we should be able to log into that. So that would be your first step here. So now let me log into that NSX Manager. All right, so now we get a brand new NSX Manager. We're going to need to read through this EULA and agree. Click continue. Gives us the option to join the CEIP. I'm going to turn that off for this environment just because we're going to be going through some stuff. And then we have the option to go through a guided setup. We're not going to do that. Aaron, I don't know if you've ever done it, if it's pretty much exactly what we would be doing anyways, but I'm not going to go through that here.
It's very close. To help customers who may not be familiar with NSX-T, the BU put together a wizard that walks through the installation. It's very similar to the steps we'll be going through. Okay.
And if you cancel out of that, by the way, you can always go back to the home screen and relaunch it, which is exactly what this is, right? So the very first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go to networking, IP address management, IP address pools, and I'm going to add a TEP pool. This is the tunnel endpoint for my, my host nodes, as well as the edge. So we're going to do that. We're going to set a subnet. We're going to do a range here. And we'll do 10.0.50.11.19. CIDR. Is it just 24? I don't think it is. Probably that.
There you go.
We won't need a gateway here, but you can put it in, but this won't be routed, so I'm going to leave that blank. And then we'll click Add and Apply and Save. And now we've got our first step completed is the tunnel endpoint pool. So now that that's completed, I'm going to go over to System here and click on Fabric. And we're going to work our way up from the bottom under this Fabric section. So number one, I'm going to add a compute manager. And what that is you're basically just connecting it to vCenter. So it has the ability to connect to your hosts and things like that, right? As of today, I believe the only type that we support is vCenter. But think of other types of virtualization compute in the future, like a, I don't know, KVM or something like that, right?
Yep.
So we'll give this a name. I'm just going to call it Lab VCSA. And you point it to the domain name.
So something to keep in mind is that this compute manager allows for the nodes to populate under that compute manager for all the clusters that will live within that vCenter. If you did not add a compute manager, you can still add each of the ESXi hosts individually.
That's right. It's just a pain in the butt to do that, right?
Exactly. It's a more tedious way of managing the nodes, the transport nodes.
So I'm going to use the administrator at vSphere.local. I'm sure best practice in a real environment with a customer would be to set up a dedicated user account for this, a service account. So we're going to click Add. It's going to find the SHA-256 thumbprint for the certificate. We'll click Add. And it's going to try and connect here. It's going to fail in my lab, and that's because I have already done this once before, and I had a different NSX Manager connected to this vCenter. So it's already registered with another one. So give this a second. It'll come up with failed, and then it'll give us the option to basically overwrite that registration. So typically you wouldn't see this in a brand new environment. If we scroll down, there is a refresh down here. So here you'll see not registered. Someone raised their hand. You can unmute yourself. Kenny, go ahead.
Me, if I did, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it looks like Kenny.
Oh, I didn't know if you said Kenny or Penny.
But yeah, feel free to speak up if you got
Yep,
questions.
Kenny G's got his hand raised, so we can. Kenny, you got anything?
Kenny, you can put it in chat or in Q&A as well if
Yeah,
you don't have a voice.
I just put his hand down. Maybe it was by accident. If he's got a question, I'm monitoring chat, and I'm sure you are too. So, go
Okay,
ahead.
cool.
Sorry, guys.
No worries. So I'm just going to basically give it the authority to overwrite that registration. And we're going to re-enter our credentials. Oops. And if we give this a minute, it should register, and it will do kind of an inventory collection here. So now it's registered, and we'll give it a minute, and it should do the collection. There we go. So now if we go up to nodes, just to prove that we did do a collection, if we change this managed by our new compute manager, we should see our clusters and our hosts within that, right? So that step is done. Now we're going to go up to transport zones, and we're going to create a couple transport zones here. So number one, we're going to create the transport zone for the overlay. We'll call it TZ overlay. We're going to give it a name. In the past, and Aaron, step in here, but I believe prior to version 2.4, you had to specify a different NVDS for an overlay transport zone versus a VLAN transport zone, which means you needed to have more physical NICs per host, whereas now you can just specify a single NVDS and mix and match those overlay port groups and the VLAN port groups. Is that right?
Yeah, you can present the transport zones to a single NVDS. In the past, there was I believe there was a requirement for individual NVDSs, which therefore required physical NICs. The NVDS kind of acts like a VDS, meaning it's you're going to do a PNIC mapping to the host. But yeah, and the overlay network, just so everyone is familiar, the overlay network is traditionally in NSXV, which was VXLAN based networks. The overlay network is now using a different encapsulation protocol called Geneve, very similar to VXLAN, a little bit better, but these Geneve networks are still using that same virtual network identifier range that's greater than 5,000 and up to 16 million. So these are all of our overlay networks that will be encapsulated within this single transport zone.
Perfect. And then we have an option here for the host membership criteria. I've been doing just standard, but know that we do support enhanced data path, which will support additional functions like NFV features and things like that. But there are some more hard requirements as far as the physical NICs and I believe the CPU as well. So I'm just going to stick with standard. If you want to read more about that, you can click the help button here, and it'll talk a little bit about it here. But Aaron, maybe you can.
Yeah, the enhanced data path is mainly meant for, like Steve mentioned, NFV or edge node functions where you need to, isolated CPU cores for network I/O, performance.
Okay. So this will be our overlay transport zone. So I'm going to choose overlay, and we'll click add. And then I'm going to add two more because I have two uplinks or uplink VLANs that I want to at least outline. We probably won't use both of them, but I want to process because you would typically want to do that in a production environment. So We're going to create TZ VLAN uplink 1. And let's call this NVDS-uplink 1. And this time we're going to choose a VLAN because it's going to be backed by VLAN. And then we'll do the same thing for uplink 2. Oops. That was right. Okay. And the reason we did that, if you look at our port groups, we have 2 different uplink port groups specified with different VLANs, 60 and 70 here, right?
You might also want to add a transport zone for any VLAN backed networks. So in the past, with NSX-V, for instance, you didn't really identify VLAN back port groups because we were already sitting on the VDS. Within the NVDS, if you wanted to put a VLAN back port group, kind of like a DV port group in a VDS, you can create a VLAN transport zone where we can put VLAN networks that would be kind of backed by a default gateway that would exist in the physical network.
So this VLAN or this port group for VM network could essentially live on that NVDS, right? As a different transport zone.
Yeah, and then you
we
can just create a transport zone for, yep, exactly.
Cool.
You can migrate it over.
All right, so we've got some transport zones. Next, we're going to go up to profiles. And here we're going to create a new uplink profile for the hosts. We're going to leverage the default one for the edge node, but we will need a different one for the host. So I'm going to click add here. And Aaron, if you want to kind of explain this as I'm doing it, might help.
Yeah, so the uplink profile is very similar to, I think, what you would kind of see in a VDS, where you basically select how you want to do your PNIC to VMNIC mapping. So you'll set the teaming method and failover order for each of the physical NICs that you will then pick within the uplink profile for the host. And just to keep in mind, the edge uplink profile is very different from a transport node uplink profile. You could use one and the same if you're using the same kind of physical NIC mapping, but in most cases, in a host environment, you're going to have, maybe 2 NICs available, and you might be using a failover method or active-active. In an edge node environment, you're going to have 2 uplinks and then a TEP interface, and you're going to have different uplink profiles for each of those interfaces.
Cool. So I'm going to assign this our overlay VLAN, which we've already got designated here, and then we want to use 1600 MTU, which we can type in, but if we just leave it blank, a little note here, it says it'll just use 1600 by default. And again, it's 1600, not 1500, because there's that little bit of overhead for the encapsulation, right? So I'll leave that. We're going to click add. Very good. So we've got our host uplink profile. Next, I want to go over to the transport node profiles. And I want to create one here. This is, again, for the hosts, right? We're going to tie the host profile we just created to essentially the NVDSs, right? So we're going to name this compute transport node profile. And we want to add just the overlay here, because this is just going to be for the hosts. The uplinks will be for the edge, which we won't need to do here.
Yeah, if you had a VLAN transport zone, you would add that one as well, but we're not doing any VLAN transition. So.
Gotcha. We'll move over to the NVDS tab. And by default, we've got 1 here. We're going to add, we'll only use this one, right? We're not going to do the others. So we're going to choose our NVDS, which we already created. The default network IO control profile is fine, but you can create your own if you want. The uplink profile now is the host uplink profile that we just created, where we designated the physical VM NICs and the failover order and the VLAN and all that. Link layer discovery protocol, I'm just going to leave that disabled for now. And then IP assignment, we're going to use our pool, and we're going to select our TEP pool that we created as our first step. And then here we're going to tie our physical NICs, so VM NIC 2 to uplink 1. And we can see that if we look at one of the hosts here. We've got VM NIC 2 and VM NIC 3 available. So that's what we're going to tie it to, right? So the VM NIC 2 to uplink 1, and then we're going to add VM NIC 3 to uplink 2. And it's pulling this uplink 1 and uplink 2 from this profile that we just created. Remember when we specified those. If we were migrating some of these physical NICs from maybe they're already assigned to like a VDS, that's where these bottom options come into play here. But since they're already unused, we'll just leave those blank. And then we click add.
Something.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say something to keep in mind. If you are working with a customer, make sure that those VM NICs are uniform, available across all the hosts within the cluster. When we apply a transport node profile to a cluster, if we try and use a VM NIC that's already used, this profile cannot be applied across the cluster. Therefore, now you're having to go to each node and kind of create this profile, or not create, but you'd have to apply this configuration manually. So learned that recently with another customer in a production install that if you don't have uniform VM NIC available, the VM NICs available, you will have an error pushing the transport node profile.
So be consistent is what you're saying. Make sure all your hosts look alike. Alrighty. So next I'm going to configure NSX for the compute node. So if we go up to nodes here, we've chosen our compute manager, Lab VCSA. We can see this cluster. I'm going to prep this cluster and not the management cluster. So we're going to configure NSX. And now we can see where that transport node profile comes into play that we just created, right? So this is going to bind it basically. So we're going to choose that. We're going to click save. And this is the process where it actually goes and installs NSX, the VIBs and all that on the host, which was similar in V, except I think they called it prepare the cluster, prep the cluster, or something like that. So that'll take a couple minutes. While that's doing its thing, we can go and deploy our Edge VM. So I'm going to go to Edge Transport Nodes here. We're going to choose Add an Edge VM. We'll give it a name. Lab NSX Edge 01. FQDN. By the way, I've already got A records in my environment for all this stuff. And I've got IPs identified, obviously. I'm going to do medium here because if you look at the PKS documentation, it requires a medium-sized edge node. It does like a hard check. So that's why I'm going to go with 4 and 8 gigs of RAM. The large is huge, and it would consume basically my entire nested lab environment, but we should be fine with medium. So we'll click next. We're going to give it a password here. I'm going to use VMware1 bang. I'm going to do that twice. I'm not going to allow SSH logins. I don't know, Aaron, if you have any thoughts on that. But I think it's best practice not to enable that. Root password, same thing. And then the audit credentials, same thing, right? This one, you actually have to type in the name as audit or whatever you want it to be. Then we'll click next. And now we're just going to point it to where we want to deploy it, right? So we're going to choose our compute manager, our only compute manager, which is our vCenter. Choose the cluster we want to deploy it in. I'll do it in the management. We can skip the resource pool and the host and let DRS put it where it wants to. And then the data store is just that local data store that I have there. So pretty easy. Click next. And now here's where we can specify essentially all the networking stuff. So I'm going to choose a static. I'm going to give it an IP of 10.0.10. I forget. We did 8. That's this one right here. Oops. So again, this is in the management cluster, right? Or the management interface. So 10.0.10.1 is the default gateway in the management port group. Domain names.
I think you have to put, Steve, I think you have to put the subnet mask.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
So /20.
There we go.
There you go.
And then we want to add our DNS servers. Oops. No, that's wrong. 10.10.90.30 and 10.10.90.41. These are my domain controllers. And then NTP servers. I always use these. Oh, okay. So this is requiring IP addresses, not FQDN. So I'm just going to point it to my domain controllers as well. Go and click next. Now here's where we add our NVDSs to the transport or the edge node here, right? So I'm going to add all of them. We want it to be on the overlay and both uplinks. And then I'm going to start with this VDS, NVDS. We're going to choose NVDS. What uplink profile do we want? We're going to use that default out of the box NSX Edge single NIC uplink profile. And then the IP assignment will be our pool. And it's going to select from our TEP pool. And then here's where we're going to bind the uplink to the overlay. And then we're going to click add another NVDS. This time we're going to use the uplink 1. And again, the same profile, the single NIC uplink profile. This doesn't require an IP address. And we're going to bind that to the uplink 1 port group. And then we're going to add one more. And we're going to do uplink 2. Same profile. Bind it to uplink 2 port group. And that's it. Anything I missed there, Aaron?
Nope, everything looks good.
All right, and we'll click finish, and now it's going to deploy that edge node into vCenter. I know this is a lot of steps. Typically, in fact, everything we've done so far, you would just do that first time, and then after that, it would be a matter of just creating new segments and firewall rules, things like that. It's much simpler once you get past this initial deployment. So now we can watch vCenter. It's deploying that edge, and it's going to take a few minutes, but we can go check on our host transport nodes here, and we can see that it did successfully deploy. It may need a minute for the node status to refresh. This should show okay here in a moment. Fingers crossed. But while that's doing that, what we can do is create a tier 1 gateway. So if we go over to networking, tier 1 gateway, we're going to add a tier 1 gateway. We'll give this a name, T1GW. We're not going to link it to tier 0 yet because we haven't created any of those, so we can come back later and do that. And let's see, the only thing we really want to change here is we don't have an edge cluster yet, but we will create one once that edge finishes deploying. We do want to change the route advertisement though.
Real quick, we won't actually identify an edge cluster for a tier 1 gateway unless you're turning on network services. So if you're going to turn on things like load balancer or VPN, for instance, then you'd identify an edge cluster to tie a what's called a services router to one of the edge nodes. But that's, we won't turn that on in a tier 1 gateway in most cases.
Gotcha. And then from a route advertisement perspective, we're going to do all connected segments and service ports. Aaron, do you want to talk through that a little bit? There's some other options here, but this is what we did last time. So.
So inside the tier 1 gateway, you can actually identify what you want to advertise to the tier 0, because everything we create within the tier 0, once we link it to the tier 1, once we link it to a tier 0, it auto plumbs all the advertised networks and advertised services that we want to provide to the tier 0 to possibly provide outside of the tier 0 to the physical network or to another tier 1 within the same data center. So we're going to identify which advertisements, which is, again, you can see it can be very, very granular to what specific services you want to provide and auto plumb into the tier 0.
All right. So we'll click Save here. And we're going to select No. We could continue configuring if we wanted to, but we don't need to. You can always come back and edit and continue editing if you want. So now we've got our tier 1 gateway. Real quick, I'm going to go back and check on our nodes. Give this a refresh. Okay, now those are up. Thank God. Everything looks good. And we should be able to check our edge transport node. Looks like it's still deploying. Yeah, like I said, that'll take a few minutes, and that's fine. So now what we could do is we can actually start creating some segments. And this is essentially, what do they call this in NSXV? It was
Logical
switch,
switches,
right?
is what
Yeah,
they call
logical
them.
switch.
Yeah.
So now it's called segments, which I think makes more sense. So we're going to add a segment, and we're going to do the typical hands-on labs, right? We're going to do web app DB. So we'll call it web. We're going to change this to tier 1 gateway. That way it can route to other segments and then ultimately to a tier 0 once we create that. We'll set our subnet here. So enter the gateway. So we're going to do 172.16.10.1 with a 24-bit subnet. And if we were doing DHCP, you would want to configure that here. We're not going to do that today. So we'll click Add, Apply, and then we choose our transport zone. This is going to be an overlay, right? Because this is hanging off the NVDS, and it's not backed by a VLAN, right? And that's it. We'll click Save. It's as simple as that. And then we can go over to vCenter. And now we see here we've got a new port group, right, which is hanging off our NVDS, which we don't even have the ability to create anymore within vCenter. All of our NSX configuration is done through the NSX GUI, which is pretty cool. I feel like that's a better model because you typically have a networking and security team that's going to be handling that stuff anyways. So it makes a lot of sense to me. In addition to that, if we go over to one of the hosts and click on virtual switches, we now see we have an NVDS down here, and it's binding to those 2 physical adapters that we specified in the profile. Right? So let's add a couple more segments here. Let's add our app. Again, we'll bind it to the T1 we created. We're going to add a subnet. 20.1, that's the gateway. So this is going to be essentially assigned to that T1, right?
Correct.
And we want an overlay transport zone. And then let's also do our DB. Oops, that's not right. 30.1. And save. So now we have our 3 overlay networks created, or segments, which we should be able to see in here. And if we give it a sec, we should see DB pop up. Oh, did I not? Yeah, I gotta click no there. There it is. And now I'm going to create 2 additional segments for the Uplink 1 and Uplink 2. These are going to be used for the T0 gateway. Is that right, Aaron?
That's correct. And in this lab environment, Steve only has one router, one physical router that we're going to pair our tier 0 with. So in that case, we're only going to use one of these uplink networks. In the case of most customers, when you're going into a production or even maybe a lab environment where they want to test production type network failover, most customers will have an A side and a B side, or an uplink A, uplink B network, where you have two different routers and two different VLANs, and you have two different uplink networks as we kind of depicted in the initial configuration. But in the case of this lab, we're only going to use uplink 1.
Yep, I'm going to create both just to show that, but when we create the interfaces on the T0, I'll only do the uplink 1, so we'll get to that in a sec here. Yep. We're not going to choose an uplink here, because this is going to be assigned to the T0 when we create it, but this is going to be in the uplink 1 transport zone. And then we do have VLANs identified for those in my handy spreadsheet here. So I've got 60 and 70 for uplink 1 and uplink 2. So I'll put 60 in here, and you gotta click add and then save. And then I'm going to do the same thing for uplink 2. But this uplink segment that we just created does not show up in vCenter because it's not an overlay transport zone, right? Something to keep in mind. Uplink 2, bound to uplink 2, and this was, what did I say, 70? VLAN 70, save. Perfect. And if we give these a couple minutes, they should all come up. I did notice it took a while for some of these to all realize, and it might be because we don't have any VMs on those segments yet. So let's check now if our edge is deployed. Looks like it's deployed, it's powered on. Is it actually finished though? So not quite yet. It's powering on, it's doing its config. So we'll give that a couple more minutes. But what we can do, if we go back to the lab in vCenter here, you see I've got 3 VMs running. These are Photon OS VMs. And if you look at each of them, I've already got them IP'd correctly. They're all on the same VDS port group right now, which is just VLAN 40. So they can't talk to anything right now, but I'm going to move those over to the new NVDS segments that we just created. So web has 172.16.10.2, app is 20.2, DB is 30.2. So let's move these, and if we were doing all of them to the same, I think you could right click and do migrate VMs, but that would move them all to a different one, right? But we can do it for, let's say, the web, for instance. So we're going to take VMs from the current VDS port group of VM network 40. We're going to move it to the web NVDS segment, and then we just pick which ones we want to move. Obviously, I'm only going to move the web. Finish. If I had a lot of VMs, it would make sense to use that method, but I mean, it's the same thing as going in here and editing settings and just putting it on a different network, right? Okay, so now those, if we look over here, we now have app 01 on the app segment. We've got DB01 on the DB segment and web 01 on the web segment. So let's do this real quick. Let's log into some of these. So here's app 01. And let's see, I am 1622. So the number one, let's try and ping the gateway for that segment, 172.16.20.1. And I can't do it yet. So we've got some more config to do. Let's see if this edge finished yet. Okay, so the edge is up. So let's add our edge cluster now that we've got our edge fully deployed. This is pretty straightforward. And the idea is you would have multiple edges within an edge cluster. We're only going to have one edge, but it makes sense to have multiple here, obviously. And we're going to use the default profile here. We didn't create a separate one. And we're going to add our single edge node into our edge cluster and click add. And we're done. So now that that is finished, let's take a look at our networking configuration overview. What do we have here? We've got a tier 0 or a tier 1 gateway connected, not connected. It's not connected to anything. So let's see, what did I forget here, Aaron?
Not connected to a tier 0, but that should be fine. So let's go to networking. Let's go to the tier 1 gateway.
Yeah.
And drop it down. And if you see the link segments, the number 3 over there. So we have our 3 interfaces. It's also, we could go ahead and click close. In the top right corner, we see it's uninitialized. Let me think about that.
In progress. Okay. So we'll give that a minute. And then this should start working here soon. There we go. It's already pinging. So there wasn't additional config to do. I just needed to wait. Okay. So we're pinging the gateway for that segment, which is the tier 1 gateway. But I can't ping the gateway for the other segments. I shouldn't be able to. Or maybe I can.
You will.
I will. Yeah. It's anything beyond that.
It's all connected.
10. Yeah, it's all connected.
It's all connected to the same tier 1.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
So then I should be able to
as well.
Yeah. 16.10.2. That's my web server. Not so much. 10.2.
Oh, open up the Web 01 and then ping your gateway.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
I wonder if it's the IP tables firewall.
We haven't. Are you talking about inside?
Inside Photon.
Yeah.
That could be it. Let's do.
Possibly.
I'd have to look up the Photon OS 3 disable firewall.
Well, it looks like it's set to accept all.
Here, let's try this. So. Oh, good. Flash wants to update. Thanks, Adobe. Oops. to do it over here too. There we go. Good old Photon OS. Okay, so it's working. Sorry about that. Let me kill this.
But you won't be able, you can't currently ping outside of the network. So you can only ping inside the T1.
Right, nothing outside. And that's because we haven't created our tier 0 yet. So let's go do that. So we're going to create a tier 0 gateway. Give it a name. Let's call it T0 gateway. We want to do active-active. If we did active standby, then we could do things like the, what do you call it? Additional services, VPN.
Mm-hmm.
What do they call that? Services?
Yeah, so you enable like network services like VPN. Yeah. You can do, NAT at the T0.
Okay, so we're going to tie this to an edge cluster. And now we're going to click Save. But we want to continue editing. Yes. And under Route Redistribution, we want to set that. So I think we want to do connected interfaces and segments for the T0, and then advertise tier 1 subnets. We'll do connected subnets. Anything else that we would need to?
Nope, I was going to say, just like the tier 1, you can see how granular and specific you can get to what you advertise out of the tier 0 and also what you advertise from the tier 1 to the physical network. So if you wanted to keep a tier 1 network, isolate it from the physical network, you could say, I can advertise my tier 0 connected segments, but I may have my tier 1 isolated from the physical network, and therefore you can advertise any of the tier 1 subnets. In this case, we want to be able to route all the way in and out, so we're going to advertise at the tier 1 and at the tier 0.
Okay. Click Save. Then we'll go to Interfaces. We're going to set, and this is where I'm only going to add uplink 1. I'm not going to add uplink 2. And that's because of what Aaron was mentioning earlier about only having one physical router in my environment as opposed to multiple ones. Right, Aaron? Or using,
yes. What
was the other protocol you were talking about where it kind of combines 2 physical routers, makes it look like one?
Yeah, Cisco uses VPC plus. Most others use like HSRP or VRRP, for instance.
Okay. So that's the IP that we're giving to this this interface, right? Which is on that subnet for uplink 1. So we're assigning it this one. And we're going to connect it to uplink 1. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we're going to choose our edge node. We'll leave the MTU so it'll inherit everything else appropriately. Click Save. This is where I would next add uplink 2 if I had 2 physical routers, right, in my environment, but I don't. So I showed you all of the other steps that we would want to do to get to that, but we'll skip it here. And then under routing, I'm going to set static routes because I don't have a dynamic routing protocol like BGP in my environment. So here I'm just going to add, we'll call this uplink 1. The network, we're just going to do a 0.0.0.0/0. And the next hop, we're going to set it to go to the gateway on that VLAN network, which is my physical router, right? Which is 10.0.60.1. And it'll be bound to that uplink. Click Apply, click Save, click Close, click Close. And now, let me show you one other thing. We still can't ping out, and that's because we haven't added the tier 0 to the tier 1 gateway. So if we go here and edit, remember we didn't choose this before because we didn't have it. Oh, and this thing always gets us. For some reason, we have to do a little refresh here before it shows up. So if we go back to T0 gateways, refresh, then go back to T1 gateways, refresh, and then edit, now it shows up. So a little bit of a bug there. Click save, click close, and give this a second, and it should be able to start pinging outbound. There it is. And that's it from a routing perspective. I think we're good. That's pretty much the end of the lab. What we could do now is we could create some security policies. We've got about 5 minutes left. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions or comments? I know we went through a lot in less than an hour here, and it's a lot to take in. For me, the first time I was, my brain was fried after this. So.
That's why we do the recording.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's create a security policy here. So we're going to go to our east-west security. Remember, we've got web, app, DB, all on their own segments, and right now they can all talk to one another. So if we go to east-west security, distributed firewall, we're going to add a policy here. We'll name it, I don't know, TAM Lab. It doesn't really matter. And we're going to add a rule. We'll give this a rule. We'll say block web, for instance, right? So where do we want to block from, I guess? Destination, let's do the destination first. So we'll add a group. We'll call this web servers. We're going to set our members, and here's where we can get creative and add some dynamic things. So virtual machine, name, contains, and we'll say web. And we'll click apply. And where do we
Click
see?
save. You have to go back and click apply and then click save.
Oh, and then I can view members. Okay.
Yep.
There we go. So it picked up that R1 VM named web 01 because it matched the criteria. And then we check the box here. So this is the destination. So anything going to web servers, let's do app and DB. So we'll add another group here. So we'll call it app servers. And we're going to set our members again. Virtual machine name contains app, apply, save. And then let's also add DB servers. You'd probably want to use tags or something a little more trustworthy in your environment. Who knows, some other VM could have a DB somewhere in it, in the name. So we see app01 and we see DB01. So the source, we're going to say from, let's say, the app servers. I'll give this a better name, block web from app, something like that. Services, we've got a lot of services to choose from here. I'm just going to say any, but we could choose, we've got 409 services we could choose from here if we wanted to just block ICMP, for instance, or some other service. I'm going to say any. Profiles, this is, I don't really know how to explain this, Aaron, but it's essentially kind of like a context profile for an application specifically. So you can see things in here like Epic, right? If you know healthcare, Epic has a profile associated with it. So we've got some out of the box.
Yeah. Closely aligned to like layer 7 application recognition is the best way to put it.
Oh, gotcha. That makes sense. And then we're going to determine where we want to apply this. We could do it at specific groups, or we could just do it at the distributed firewall. I'll do that. Aaron, one thing I noticed in here, when we did this with NSX 2.4, we had the option to specify a domain, which I think mapped directly into PKS with the concept of the domains that they have there. In 2.4.1, they don't have it. It's not in here. So
I think we may have to click the little wheel on the far right, but
no, I was
I
playing
guess you're
around
right. I
last
guess
night. Yeah, it's gone. I don't know.
yeah.
Anyway,
Hmm.
so we're going to drop this traffic, and as soon as I click publish, it should stop pinging. So I'm going to start a ping here from my app server to my web server. I'm sure I already have it up here. That is my web server. It's working. We'll click publish. And now it's not working. Simple as that. And that leaves us with 30 seconds before the top of the hour. So good timing. We could also do things like north-south firewall. North-south firewall. But that may cause some hairpinning. So
yeah,
keep that in
something to
mind.
keep in mind is that when you do north to south firewalling with a customer, that means it must go to the SR that runs on the edge node to provide that firewalling. So if you're going between, like, let's say 2 network segments and you're doing north to south firewalling on a tier 1 that prevents network traffic from one segment to another, it will have to hairpin the edge node. So not saying you avoid it, but when necessary, use it. But it's there for customers to make the decision on.
Very good. And then just to show one other thing, if we go over to inventory here, here's where we can see those things that we just created on the fly, right? So our groups, our app servers, DB servers. You can see your virtual machines in here, and you can edit them and apply some tags and things like that. So yeah, that's where you manage.
One last thing. One last thing. If we go to system real quick, I just wanted to identify that we only have a single NSX manager, and as Steve was going through the initial deployment of that OVF at the beginning, you can deploy a second and third from this interface. You'll see add nodes. Please don't have customers deploy 3 virtual managers via the OVF. Have them only deploy 1, and then you will add multiple NSX Manager nodes up to 3 from here. Sometimes customers get a little anxious and they're like, hey, I'm going to deploy all 3 via the OVF, and then you end up having to delete the other 2. So they'll deploy 1. This is the one that we see here, and then you'll add nodes. And then as Steve was identifying the virtual IP, once you have 3 nodes, 3 manager controller clusters, nodes in the cluster, I should say, you can then assign a virtual IP to all 3, and the master, which is primarily the first one that gets deployed, will then answer to that BIP. And if that master goes away, that BIP will get assigned to a secondary or tertiary node. And then you don't have to worry about having to log into each individual IP to access the NSX-T Manager UI. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, good point. I glossed over that. But that's it. I know that was a lot. Maybe we schedule another session, kind of like day 2 operations. Now that it's deployed, what else can we do from here? Because this is a lot to take in for sure, especially if you're not strong with networking or you've just never done a lot with NSX. It's a lot of new concepts. So, anybody have any feedback, any questions, any thoughts? Last call before we close it out.